In the year 1457, at Albalina, the fog did more than cover the valley. It hid a truth that would make Europe tremble. In a mist so dense it swallowed the sky, 40,000 Ottoman soldiers marched with the pride of a rising empire, certain that no force on earth could stop them. None of them knew that in just a few moments, their formation would collapse faster than any defeat of the century, because they did not know that deep within the forest, 8,000 silent eyes were watching their every step. Fog poured into the valley, so thick it swallowed the last traces of light, turning the world into a heavy, suffocating sea of white. An Ottoman soldier stood inside that veil, hearing only the scrape of stones sliding down invisible cliffs, the harsh grinding echoing like human bones snapping. From far ahead, a horse screamed through the white wall, the sound stretching, then fading as if crushed by an unseen hand. A massive boulder tore through the air and crashed beside him, the ground shaking as if some giant creature crawled beneath his feet. The soldier panicked, reached out into the void, and touched nothing but thick, clinging white. His breath tightened, mixing with the smell of cold mud and fresh blood. He whispered through broken breaths, "I can't see anything. What am I fighting out here?" The historian Barleti wrote that the Battle of Albulena was like a storm unleashed upon mankind. And to understand why this valley became the grave of an entire army, we must return to the beginning. After Constantinople fell, Europe collapsed into silent panic. Old kingdoms stared at one another, afraid to admit what was coming. Italy, Venice, and Naples, instead of uniting, fought bitterly for influence and gold. No one looked eastward, where the rising storm gathered power with each passing month. Only Albania remained alone, small, isolated, yet unbroken. Kritovalos recorded this trembling world in his history of Mehmet Thekin. If Albania fell, the road into Italy would open wide before the empire. The Pope's final defensive line would vanish as if it never existed. And the Adriatic Sea, from that moment onward, would belong entirely to the Ottomans. But the true tragedy was already forming deep inside the heart of Albania itself. Before he became a symbol of resistance, Skanderbeg had once served as a commander in the Ottoman ranks. He was taken to the Sultan in Edirne as a child, living as a hostage inside a vast palace. In those cold stone corridors, the young commander learned Turkish, studied warfare, and endured the iron discipline of the Janissaries. He rode war horses before his feet could reach the stirrups, and he did not tremble under the rain of arrows screaming down. But as he grew older, he witnessed burning villages, children running across fields of corpses. From those sights, the flame of defiance was born. When he returned to Albania, he raised the Black Eagle banner, declaring resistance against an entire empire. For 20 years, this small nation held firm against countless invasions. Venetian archives and Barleti record that Ottoman numbers often exceeded 40,000. But just before the year 1457, a single blow shattered Albania. During those long years in Edirne, Skanderbeg was forged into a weapon of the empire. You think a 140-kilogram deadlift is impressive? Janissaries did that every day, but with bowstrings and bare hands. He endured Janissary training, where a soldier had to draw bows weighing 120 to 150 pounds. A draw strength far beyond what most modern people can imagine. Powerful enough to tear through armor as thick as oak. He trained to ride war horses under arrow storms, trained in close combat until his arms went numb, and trained to control his breath under the pressure of battlefield masters. Ottoman chroniclers would later acknowledge his brilliance and fearsome reputation. That Albanian boy, who struck every target even at full gallop, and remained calm beneath a hail of arrows as if born to command. The Ottomans called him Skanderbeg, Lord Alexander, comparing him to Alexander the Great. But no discipline could extinguish one thing: the memory of a boy standing on a hill, watching his homeland burn, watching villagers driven out, watching war devour everything he had ever known. That hatred flowed in him like blood, like arrows that could never be pulled out. Then one night, in 1443, he made a historic choice. He deserted, returned to Albania, gathered his people, seized the city of Kruja, and swore to fight. He raised the Black Eagle banner, vowing to defend Albania as a declaration of war against an entire empire. He built defenses around mountains and forests, narrow paths, treacherous rocky slopes, places only Albanians understood, through every shift of wind and every crack in the stone. Yet even in victory, Skanderbeg remained haunted, carrying the guilt of failing to save his villagers from Ottoman blades in earlier battles. He was the unbreakable Albanian. But even a great warrior has a weakness, and the cruelest blow would not come from his enemies. It would come from the one he loved and trusted most. The nephew he cherished like a son, now preparing to strike him from behind. To understand the weight pressing down on Skanderbeg, we must remember the disaster at Berat in the year 1455, when Pasha Ferouz set a trap as cold as a blade. He sent false messages, luring Skanderbeg deep into the Berat Valley, where the narrow terrain turned every tactic into nothing. When the Albanians entered, the trap snapped shut. Barleti recorded that tragedy with a chilling line. In a single day, his army was shattered like ashes before the wind. Spears splintered, cavalry were crushed beneath iron hooves, and screams echoed against the mountain stone. An Albanian soldier fled, tears mixing with dust, running and crying out in despair. I am no longer worthy to call myself a child of the mountains. Skanderbeg stood in the ruined camp, unable to speak a single word. He saw the people's faith in him break, like pieces of armor falling to the ground. The people lost trust in their only hero. They looked at him with a different gaze. Not hatred, but hopelessness. Whispers spread, saying the age of the Black Eagle was ending, that Albania had fallen and would never rise again. Albania had collapsed once before. They knew the pain of being scattered. And in that moment, when the nation was gasping for breath, the deadliest blow came from a place no one expected. Skanderbeg was deeply wounded by the defeat at Berat. Yet the cut from an enemy's blade was nothing compared to the betrayal of his own blood. Hamza Kastriadi grew up in Skanderbeg's home, not merely as a nephew, but as if he were his own son, a gifted young man, raised and loved as family. He followed Skanderbeg into the camps, rode behind him on horseback, learned to wield a sword through every strike his uncle taught, and everyone believed, if Albania had a future, Hamza would be the one to carry it. But inside, Hamza burned a fierce hunger for glory, a desire greater than loyalty. Ottoman envoys came in the shadows, masters of manipulation, and they reached him. They used no force, only sweet temptations, gold, titles, and the chance to become great. Whispers of power a young warrior could hardly refuse. They told him, "You can become great without living beneath the shadow of a legend." The historian Kritovalis would later write, Hamza chased glory faster than honor. And in sleepless nights, ambition slowly conquered gratitude. The boy who had followed Skanderbeg since childhood, who rode the same war horse, who learned every cut of the blade, now saw another path. A path no longer beneath the shadow of his legendary uncle. When he entered the Ottoman envoy's tent, Hamza lowered his head and swore loyalty to the Ottomans, loyalty to the Crescent. He swore, his voice cold as steel. I will bring his head to the Sultan's feet. In that moment, Albania lost its brightest sun, and those words marked the beginning of the 1457 campaign. And that oath awakened an empire. Sultan Mehmed II now possessed the one thing he needed most: someone who knew the heart, the mind, and every secret of Albania, and knew how to break it. The news of Hamza's betrayal entered the halls of Topkapi, and the air changed color as steel plunged into cold water, triggering a merciless campaign. No one shouted, no one cursed. Only the heavy footsteps of summoned commanders echoed into the palace courtyard, where the Balkan maps were already waiting. Red ink lines cut across Macedonia. Debar, Ohrid, like slashes across an animal's hide. Mobilization orders were issued without a single war drum. The rolls were opened. Each unit counted their horses, their bowstrings, their armor. For weeks, the forges burned through the night, hammers striking steel in a rhythm of metal thunder that rolled deep into the Balkan forests. Records from the Ottoman archives show this campaign was no mere punishment, but a carefully calculated strike. Cavalry formed into clusters. Janissaries moved by companies. Gunners inspected each cannon, heavy as mountain stone. A Syrian archer tested his bowstring, heard the dry snap, and knew the battlefield was about to swallow men whole. A supply soldier wrote in his ledger, rice, oil, medicine, rope, enough for 3 weeks of marching. When the officers assembled in the Topkapi courtyard, Mehmed stood on the palace balcony, Sultan Mehmed II staring into the distance, his gaze cold and final like a delivered verdict. He declared, "When the last eagle dies, the Adriatic will be mine." No one dared lift their head when he spoke, because all understood this was no longer war. It was the ending of a nation. The massive army of 40,000 began its march. Miles of earth trembling beneath hooves and heavy wagon wheels. This was the final hunt in its truest form. Inside the camps, officers laughed with unshakable confidence. To them, this campaign was a simple, final formality. The last spear thrust to finish a dying beast. But what the Empire did not expect was that the man they intended to hunt was already waiting in the mountains. Skanderbeg was ready. This time, the Albanian hero would not run. He would choose the place to fight. One morning, a rumor crossed the mountains. Sultan Mehmed II was preparing a new campaign. People whispered that 40,000 soldiers were marching from Macedonia, led by Hamza himself, the betrayer. To the north, Skanderbeg stood before a truth cold as stone. Albania had no allies left. But this time, he would not run. He summoned his commanders into a small room, firelight flickering across faces carved with exhaustion, and he made no promise of a glorious victory. Skanderbeg stayed silent for a moment, then spoke slowly, deeply, as if with his very soul. I promise no victory. I promise only honor. His army numbered only 8,000, most of them farmers and shepherds. For many, it was their first time holding a spear. Hands trembling, but eyes unwavering. Along the mountain slopes, women led their children into the deep forests, carrying small sacks of grain, a little salt, and whispered prayers fading into the dark. They walked without daring to look back, because they all knew turning around meant seeing their loved ones for the last time. And then Skanderbeg found something that changed the balance entirely. A weapon born from his homeland itself. Skanderbeg rode through every valley, every stream, studying each crack in the rock, every patch of forest, every path he had walked since childhood. In the despair of an entire nation, he saw what the Ottomans had never understood. Between two dark mountain ranges, choked with trees, Skanderbeg found the perfect place. Albalena. Albalina was not a valley. It was the stone throat of a giant beast. A narrow passage carved between mountains, wide enough for only a few ranks to pass at a time. Fog fell thick like a white curtain, hiding every smallest movement. On both sides rose sheer cliffs, where a single boulder could kill a dozen cavalry. No large army could form lines here, could not turn, could not expand, could barely breathe. Geographically, Albalina functioned as a natural bottleneck. A small force on the heights could control an army 5 times its size. And in that suffocating space, Skanderbeg understood a brutal truth. The more men there were, the faster they would choke and die. The terrain erased the Ottomans' numerical advantage entirely. This was the decision of a military genius. But the terrain was only the foundation. It needed to be sharpened. Next came the deadly traps, prepared in absolute silence. The terrain was only a canvas. Now Skanderbeg had to paint a detailed map of death upon it. In the thick midnight of Albalina, the Albanians began raising ancient killing machines. They worked for days and nights without rest. They dug deep pits wide enough to swallow a mounted rider, covered them with branches and dry leaves so thin they became perfect traps. Higher up, long, heavy logs were chosen with care, tied with rough rope, waiting for a single cut, and an entire mountainside would crash down like a deliberate landslide. Along the cliffs, archers lay flat among pine thickets, bodies hidden beneath dry leaves, bows half drawn, ready to turn the space below into a storm of steel. They tied rounded stones with coarse braids, hung them from natural hooks, creating pendulum traps that could break 3 men with a single swing. The entire Albanian people took part in this battle. Through the night, faint hammering and axe strikes echoed softly. Not the sounds of war, but of a nation trying to save its own fate. No one spoke a word. Not a single horse neighed. Archaeologists, based on old records and finds near the Mat region, believe some of these stone and earth trap structures still survive today. The Albanians turned their homeland into a living fortress, silent, waiting. Meanwhile, 40,000 Ottoman soldiers were marching straight into a death trap, completely unaware. At dawn in Albalina, fog poured into the valley, so thick it swallowed the sun whole. The massive Ottoman army advanced into the Albulena gorge, carrying the pride of an empire that believed it could not be defeated. They entered in long ranks, as if walking into the open mouth of something unnamed. The green banners became faint streaks of color, dissolving into the endless white of the morning. Sound vanished as well. No drums, no neighing, footsteps sinking as if swallowed by the earth. Hamza pulled his reins, jaw tightening with suspicion. But the path behind had already narrowed too much to turn back. Officers lost contact. The front could not hear the rear. The rear had no idea what waited ahead. The fog turned the army into silhouettes, wandering through the throat of an invisible beast. Hamza looked up. The rocks seemed too sharp, the pines too still, as if waiting. He felt something wrong, a danger without shape stalking them. But the formation was already too deep in the gorge. Retreat was impossible. The fog of war had consumed them completely. And in that moment, the mountain began to speak. At the rear of the Ottoman column, the first sound they heard was not a human voice, but the snap of ropes breaking, sharp as cracking bones. Massive wooden beams plunged down the slope, dragging earth and stone, sealing the retreat completely. Hundreds of cavalry were crushed in a single breath. Panic spreading through the valley like fire meeting wind. This was the first strike, the cutting of the escape. Then the second strike fell from above, a rain of stone, of timber, of metal, arrows and rocks cascading through the fog from the ridge lines. From within the mist, Ottoman soldiers saw only shifting shadows, no direction, no shapes, only the hiss of wind and the brutal crash of impact. A janissary screamed, "Where am I being attacked from? From the sky?" But from above. Skanderbeg saw everything as a living map. He saw every gap, every choke point, every flow of an army trapped inside nature's own jaws. He pointed down the slope, and the silent signal prepared for hours erupted at once. The third strike hit. Pitfalls and cavalry from both flanks. Albanian horsemen charged down the slopes, hooves smashing against stone like funeral drums. They slammed into the Ottoman flank, where there were no shields, no formations, no control. The Ottomans turned to fight back, but the fog betrayed them. Soldiers struck their own comrades, Ottoman armor clashing against Ottoman armor, their blood mixing, none able to see where the enemy truly was. A Venetian archer once wrote, "At the foot of that mountain, no one ever saw the man who killed him." Barleti described it too. It was no longer a battle, it was a flood of final cries. And as thousands struggled in the chaos, a cold truth crept through them like night fog. The ambush was not over. It had only begun. But night would be the real nightmare. When night fell over Albalina, the ground turned into cold mud mixed with blood and rain. Albanian torches flared across the slopes, their light reflecting off thousands of terrified faces trapped in the valley below. Fire met wind. Wind met rain, creating a flickering glow like the gates of hell opening. Screams slammed into the cliffs and echoed back, making the Ottomans believe the enemy surrounded them from all sides. Then a war horn rose, long, deep, cutting through the night like the call of an ancient beast. The Albanians surged down for the final assault. No hesitation, no mercy. The ridgelines erupted in flames, the entire mountain blazing like a living volcano, and from both sides, Albanian cavalry descended like burning phantoms. Hamza panicked, yanked his reins, shouting in despair, "Break the encirclement. Anyone alive, follow me." But fog, fire, and mountain stone had sealed every escape. The forest paths he once followed beside Skanderbeg were now the roads leading the Ottomans to their deaths. He understood, too late, that he had chosen the wrong side in the wrong war. The green banners of the Ottomans were trampled into the mud. Cries for help vanished into the freezing mist. The exits were sealed completely. And when the exits were sealed, the hope of an entire army died with the last torch. The deep mud swallowed horse hooves, collapsing cavalry into one another like walls of flesh. Ottoman soldiers slipped, crushed beneath the weight of their own comrades, unable to breathe, unable to escape. Hamza stood in the heart of the chaos, eyes wide, finally understanding the circle had closed completely. A dying soldier whispered, voice trembling toward its final breath, "We are not fighting the Albanians, we are fighting the mountain." The gifted nephew, the man who once swore to bring his uncle's head to the capital, was now isolated, defeated by the very homeland he betrayed. The slaughter stretched on until the break of dawn. Then morning arrived, bringing with it the most terrifying silence of all. Dawn crawled over Albalina, not with light, but with a silence heavy as stone. The Albalina Valley was now covered in a thick, dreadful fog, like a giant burial shroud laid over the bodies of 40,000 men. The mist thinned slowly, revealing earth stained with footprints, dead horses, and human shapes lying still, like the final shadows left behind by night. The small stream cutting through the valley had turned a deep red, flowing quietly, as if afraid to wake the dead. The Albanians walked down, without cheering, without raising their helmets, only bowing their heads, as if passing through the cemetery of their own kin. They lifted their fallen comrades, wiped mud from cold faces, and laid them in long rows upon the damp ground. No one spoke a word. Even Skanderbeg stood motionless, one hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword, eyes following each body carried out of the morning fog. The historian Barleti later wrote, "The silence of Albulena was heavier than any war drum." And it was true. Victory has never been light. It demands life for life, bone for bone, leaving behind an emptiness where voices once rose. When the sun finally climbed above the peaks, Albalena was no longer a battlefield. It had become a reminder, carved into stone, of the price a small nation must pay to stand against an empire. Then, that silence was shattered, and the news spread faster than the wind. The news of Albalena left the valley quickly, faster than the wind racing across the Balkan ranges. Salt traders carried the tale to Lesia, then to the Venetian harbors, where merchants froze in disbelief upon hearing that 40,000 Ottoman soldiers had been broken inside white fog. Only weeks later, church bells in Rome rang without pause, as if Europe had been pulled back from the edge of a cliff. Priests fell to their knees in gratitude, and envoys repeated the same words. Skanderbeg has done what no one dared believe. In the Vatican, the Pope listened to the first report and whispered a line that entered the memory of history. "That man is the shield of Christendom." In Constantinople, news of the catastrophe fell into the cold silence of the palace. No one dared look up. No one dared speak. For this was the first time the empire of Mehmed II had suffered a wound this deep. Not a tactical failure, but a warning that even a mighty war machine could shatter before the will of a small nation. And this was the final truth, carved into the stone of Albalina. Europe that day was not saved by wealthy kings, but by 8,000 people who refused to die for nothing. And when the last morning mist lifted from Albalina, the truth of an entire age appeared. No king sent troops in time. No court opened its coffers in time. Only 8,000 remained, standing against the iron tide of the strongest empire of the 15th century. They did not fight to have their names written in chronicles. They fought for the soil beneath their feet, for the homes burning behind them, for their children hiding in the deep forests, and for a vow never to bow. Scanderbeg looked toward the white blurred valley, knowing this victory would not bring peace. But he also knew, from that day on, Europe understood something different, that the greatest fortresses do not rise from flat plains, but from the hearts of small nations that refuse to kneel. Albalina became a warning, and an immortal vow of an entire mountain land. That is when freedom is pushed to the edge of death. Even a narrow valley is enough to change the fate of a continent.